Hello, this is the show for salespeople and their leadership wanting expert B2B sales insights and ideas. It helps them to become even better at generating revenues. My name is Gert Schultz. Welcome to Best Practice for Sales Professionals. And today we're going to get insight into the decision-making process buyers apply when selecting a new vendor. My guest is a professional buyer, and she used to buy media broadcasting technologies for companies like MTV. Now she helps companies transform their buying processes. Maria Ryan, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Gert. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Maria, thanks for making the time today. So to start off with, how do you make a decision which vendor to go for in a buying situation?
Well, there are many facets to the decision, many facets to a good decision anyway, but fundamentally at the core of a really good decision for my clients would be to find the vendor that they have and can have the best relationship with, both in the process of the purchase that they're considering at this time, and also, but more importantly, actually, going forward for both of their future strategic directions. The relationship is absolutely at the core of a really good decision in this space. We're talking about investments, significant investments, multi-million pounds in some cases. These are not decisions they make overnight. And they're not the decisions that they're going to backtrack from and change and make again in any kind of near future. And so without a really good relationship at the core of this decision between the two companies, then unfortunately I wouldn't suggest that would be the best purchasing decision.
That's fascinating, because that's what sellers would say as well. You know, it's all about the relationships. Why, though, should buyers and sellers be concerned with building a relationship, do you think?
Well, because as I say, certainly the purchasing that I am brought in to advise on is significant financial investment. It's also significant organisational transformation, or at least should be. These types of technology investments won't be made without probably significant cost saving. And with cost saving, one needs to change the organisation. And with change in organisation, it's an upheaval for everybody, for the client, for the vendor trying to deliver against the objectives what the technology is supposed to be bringing into an organization that's also changing from underneath it sometimes. And so there's going to be some adversity, there's going to be some bumps in the road. And the partners of the partnership between the buyer and the seller needs to be really, really solid in those situations to get through them. Even in the most seamless of implementations, it will never go without a problem. And unless you are dealing with two companies who are willing to work together and move forward together and both feel that they are both delivering something, not the buyer sitting back and expecting the seller to simply deliver, and not the seller to simply put the product at the front door and expect the buyer to make it work, but really to engage with each other, to have that relationship at that time of implementation, but also going forward for both of the futures of both of these companies, right? So they're both aligning to each other's strategic goals and directions. That's why relationships are so important at the center of all of these buying choices, I say.
So do you think that salespeople perhaps underrate the importance of the relationship in your experience?
I think it depends on the seller. And I think also it depends on the buyer. So, you know, I can deal with some very traditional organizations who really feel it's down, we've paid the money, we've paid the investment, it just needs to work. And that's for me or somebody like me to work within the organization to try and adjust that thinking. Because the buyer also needs to meet the seller somewhere along this path. You know, it can't be, as I said, previously, it can't just be either the buyer or the seller's responsibility. It's the partnership, it's the relationship between the two that ultimately delivers the objectives for both companies, because the seller doesn't want an implementation that the buyer won't shout loudly and positively about either. So it's for everybody's benefit that this relationship is there, it's solid, it's important, and they understand each other and they're aligned, that the organizations are aligned.
Okay, got you on that. So when you start working with organizations to improve their RFP process, what are the typical issues you come across within those organizations?
Well, often I'm brought in where the some of the decisions, or at least some of the requirements have been gathered. And so I'm brought in to finesse and to get the RFP out the door and suggest vendors that it should go to. More often than not, what I find myself doing is spending time rewinding a little bit with the client, simply to understand for myself, and therefore so I can publicize the reasons why they're making this change. And in some cases, those very basic questions haven't been asked. They haven't asked those of themselves. And so it could be driven from the RFP that I could receive to finesse, could be very slanted towards a certain area in the organization. And actually a really good RFP, an RFP that gives the vendor the best chance to respond to, is one that's representative of all of the organization, or all of the organization that's going to be impacted by this change. And so a really good RFP is representative of all impacted areas, has been seen by all the stakeholders of these impacted areas, has buy-in from the client as much as possible. Change is difficult. We won't always get everybody on board all the time, but as far as possible, as much buy-in from the client to actually actively want this change, or at least understand the reasons why this change is happening and be on board with that. Because until that's there, then it really isn't a joined up request to put out to market. It isn't something somebody can respond to coherently, because it's not coherent in itself.
Understood. And again, I'm just thinking about the questions that you might ask in these organizations that will tease out what they really are after, which is actually the job of a salesperson as well, funny enough. So what does good look like in terms of preparing an RFP in your world?
Well, good looks like, as I said, a well-rounded, fully representative request. And the important thing, which is often also missed, is the fact that it is a request. People are requesting for information, they're requesting for a proposal. So to make sure that the client hasn't already made that decision themselves, they haven't already decided upon what the technology is, they're actually asking technology providers to do what they do best, which is to put a proposal together to provide a technology, to provide a solution. And so to not have gone too far down the decision process in their own minds before it even goes out to market, so that all vendors are getting a fair crack at the deal, if you like. And in answer to your point that these are the questions that salespeople would ask the C-level stakeholders, but often the salespeople aren't getting access to the C-level stakeholders, not to that kind of level of in-depth questioning. And so I think that's why I very much see this kind of role as sitting in between the two, to make sure I'm joining together two organizations that can work well together. So those relationships, that the seller can have those relationships with the buyer, C-level decision makers, that they don't necessarily get before they've actually purchased.
One final question, a cheeky one this time. If you could give a seller one piece of advice, just one, dealing with buyers and being in an RFP process, what would that one piece of advice be for a salesperson?
One piece of advice would be to listen. Make sure you really, really listen. And if you don't understand, ask questions. Don't presume. Often I'm dealing with lots of different technology providers who are all offering something very, very similar. So a lot of the products are exactly the same, and there can be a presumption and assumption, easy for me to say, that you know what the buyer wants. But you probably don't, unless you really, really have spent time with the buyer, understood what it is that they are looking for, and really listen to them and try and understand them at a more granular level, not just what you're reading in the document, but get, as I say, to the heartbeat of the organization and try and understand where they are, where they're trying to go, where these C-level leaders are trying to take the organization, and take it on board. And if it's not your product, then it's not your product.
Thanks very much for that excellent piece of advice, Maria. Thanks for coming on the show, and let's catch up soon.
Thanks, Gert.